only possible response of monarchical Europe to the events of the French Revolution was, of course, war. But it wasn't just any kind of war, it was a kind of crusade in which monarchy, legitimacy of authority, an established church, property rights, and privilege set out to contain not France, but the ideas of the French Revolution. Austria, Prussia, Britain, Russia formed alliances to suppress the revolution and restore the royal house of Bourbon. Moreover, the Allies were in an extremely strong position. The armies of France were left leaderless after the defection of most of the noble officers. The nobles realized that they were endangered and they left with the other émigrés, and so the army was without its natural leadership. Also, the country was in dire financial straits. But nevertheless, France responded in a way that was to change, to some degree, the nature of warfare. France created a nation in arms. All resources were to be made available to fight, and all able-bodied men were to consider themselves soldiers. So with this new nation under arms, by 1792, France was actually able to go on the offensive. On top of that, the European coalition was unable to work together, and this undermined its perceived advantage. But to some extent, it wasn't either of these things that really made the difference. There was a secret weapon, and that was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, of course, is one of the most dramatic figures of European history. He was also a curious mixture of several elements, including extreme ambition, extraordinary intelligence, and a desire to make France the most powerful state on the continent. He was a product of the Enlightenment. He was a rationalist. He detested feudalism, inequality, religious intolerance. He also was extraordinarily ambitious. His background is even stranger given this ambition and what he did in France and for France. He wasn't really French, but he was Corsican. He came from that outpost of French power in the Mediterranean. His very large family was rude in many ways, a member of the local nobility, but in Corsica, that doesn't say much. He was an outsider, and he was sent to the Royal Military Academy in Paris, where he was treated very badly because of his Italian accent. He spoke French with that Corsican Italian accent, and the aristocratic young soldiers around him made great fun of him. But after the revolution, he was given an opportunity. The revolution made Napoleon, gave him a series of options that he otherwise would not have had. He had to, for example, reestablish a social position in France. Being a minor Corsican noble meant very, very little in France, even after the revolution. And one of the first things he did was make a good marriage. He married Josephine de Beauharnais. Josephine was the widow of an aristocrat, the Vicomte de Beauharnais, who had been executed, guillotined during the Terror. She was well off. Her family had estates in the French West Indies. In fact, she may indeed have been a Creole. But nevertheless, she provided him with the kind of social entree and style that he needed in order to enter society at the level which he desired. He became a national hero as well. In 1794, he succeeded in driving the English fleet that had been blocking the harbor of Toulon out of French waters. This success made the Directory give him a command despite his young age. In 1795, he was sent to Italy to fight the coalition and distinguish himself. And so he did. In victory after victory, in places like Marengo, he made a name for himself so that he was, in fact, one of the heroes of the Revolutionary Army. He was also ambitious, and he also saw that there were opportunities that perhaps the Directory did not. He suggested, and the Directory agreed, that perhaps one way of weakening England would be to attack its access to empire, particularly India. So a great French fleet was sent to Egypt, and a large French army to conquer Egypt. Well, the French fleet in 1799 was completely destroyed in the harbor of Aboukir Bay by the British, and the French soldiers, despite the fact, as Napoleon remarked, 20 centuries looked down upon, found themselves being decimated by disease. Napoleon, despite the condition that his army was in, despite the fact that he had lost his fleet and the army had no way to return home, stole away from his army and returned to Paris in 1799 because he'd been informed that events there made his opportunities very, very great indeed. It was a perfect moment to effect a coup d'etat, and so he did. In November of 1799 was that whiff of grape shot, the coup d'etat that established Napoleon as, in fact, the military dictator of France. Initially, he agreed to be one of three, with the title of First Consul, but there were two others. And from 1800 to 1802, he worked with those two other consuls to try and concentrate power, while all the time winning spectacular victories in the field. He was also extraordinarily wise and realized that the divisions in French society had to be healed if France was ever to overcome the problems inherent in not only the alliance against her, but also the divisions internally that gave such advantage to that alliance. So in 1801, he made peace with the Roman Catholic Church. He signed a concordat with the Pope, Pius VII, whom he kidnapped, but nevertheless, that was the sort of thing Napoleon did. And the concordat reestablished Roman Catholicism as the official, but not the exclusive religion of France. This concordat of 1801 was a remarkable document because what it succeeded in doing was reconciling a very large part of the population of France to Napoleon and his regime. We had seen with the civil constitution of the clergy how French society had been divided between the jurors and non-jurors, how the ultramontanes had looked beyond France for salvation. Napoleon solved that problem with the Concordat. It placated many of the émigrés, many of whom returned to France because what they saw is the injustice of the civil constitution was now undone. Similarly, many of those who were hostile to the regime now made their peace because France was once more a Catholic country. With this strength, with his recognition of his ability to manipulate the situation, and with the fame and almost the adulation he had achieved through his military victories, in 1802 he declared himself First Consul for life. That wasn't enough. And in 1804, he proclaimed himself Emperor of the French. That is, Emperor of the French people, not King of France, not part of the old regime that had been overthrown with the Revolution, but a new regime. Emperor of the French people that had some element to it that would reflect some of the Enlightenment ideas of the role of popular sovereignty. And indeed, Napoleon did then proceed to have his imperial position approved in a plebiscite. The event of Napoleon's coronation indicates very much the kind of state that he was beginning to develop, because it was, on the one hand, an act of remarkable ambition. It was an act of almost overweening pride to name yourself an emperor of a country when, in fact, you were born in one of its farthest provinces and you had no claim to any throne except military victory and great popularity. But he also, as with the Concordat, did something brilliant. He reestablished the concept of monarchy. He reestablished an idea that was still part of the collective unconscious and the traditional perspective of a large number, probably a plurality of Frenchmen. They realized with the establishment of the monarchy, moreover, that the hierarchy of society was being reaffirmed, but not in the way that the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy would be. It wasn't a return to what was there before the Revolution. Napoleon was a product of the Revolution, and to some extent, his imperial grandeur was a recognition that the empire was the culmination of the acts of the Revolution. We can see in one of the most iconic pictures, because art is a form of propaganda always, the great picture painted of the coronation of Napoleon by Jacques-Louis David. First, we must remember that Jacques-Louis David had been a member of the Committee of Public Safety during the Terror, showing that even artists can go bad. But in this wonderful, enormous picture now in the Louvre, we see Napoleon acting out his strategy. First of all, he puts the crown on his own head. He doesn't have anyone do it for him, certainly not an archbishop, and certainly not the Pope, who was in fact there. Remember, he was kidnapped. And David has him raising his fingers as in benediction, although he did no such thing. He wasn't terribly fond of the circumstance in which he found himself. Also, Napoleon put the crown on Josephine's head. Napoleon crowned her. And the image of his mother, Madame Mère, as she was known, who probably wasn't even there, indicates that connection of a kind of dynasty. Madame Mère was a very simple woman from Corsica, but nevertheless, having her, to some extent, as almost the focus of that picture, indicates that the concept of bloodline and dynasty has been recognized. I think that part of Napoleon's psychology was trying to get some measure of recognition and approval from his mother, because after every victory and after he became emperor, he would go to his mother and say, "Well, what do you think now?" And her response was always the same: "It's very nice as long as it lasts." So that perhaps was what was driving Napoleon all along. Napoleon then, in his coronation, the creation of the empire, was indicating that he was not just another military adventurer, a man on horseback becoming a parvenu emperor. He, in fact, was something more. He was creating a new France, and very consciously, and he wanted to sell himself as a culmination of the ideals of the revolution, at least all the good ideals. And in many instances, he succeeded, in part because he was one of the greatest administrative geniuses that ever ruled France. For example, in 1804, Napoleon gave France the legal system that it still enjoys, as do a number of other constituencies, including the province of Quebec in Canada, the Code Napoleon. The Code Napoleon is the civil law of France. Before the Revolution, there were 366 local law codes, and with the Code Napoleon in 1804, there was one. Moreover, it was a system inspired by the Enlightenment. It provided protection of the weak from the powerful. It indicated that all Frenchmen, regardless of class, were protected equally by the law. It reflected enlightened ideas such as the liberty and the freedom of the individual, equality before the law, a secular state, again, Napoleon crowned himself, freedom of conscience, and freedom to choose a profession. This wasn't just an administrative convenience on Napoleon's part. It just wasn't an exercise in statecraft, illustrating, again, his great gifts as an administrator. It was, again, one of Napoleon's brilliant strategic moves, like the Concordat and like the coronation. Because what he was doing in the Code Napoleon was reinforcing the most powerful domestic support in France, the property-owning bourgeoisie, those lawyers, middle-class individuals, and others who wanted their property protected, wanted their natural rights protected, and wanted the revolution to be those reflections of the Enlightenment that had gone astray during the Terror, but now had been reinforced and now had been placed back into a hierarchical structure that gave them a position that was recognized and could be protected by law. The Code Napoleon is a truly remarkable document, and all I need to say is that after Napoleon fell, it was kept in place, and indeed was even adopted by some nations that had been Napoleon's most committed enemies. Napoleon did other things, though. He restructured French society, and he did so through recognition and through education. Napoleon used to always say that men are led with baubles. By that, he meant that if you give them appropriate recognition, they will do anything for you. So he created the Legion of Honor, which again exists to this day. This was to recognize contributions to France, not just military, but civil, artistic, any element that would make a contribution to the culture and glory of France could earn the Legion of Honor. He created, moreover, a new aristocracy. It's one thing to make yourself an emperor. It's something else to begin to bestow titles of honor, titles of nobility to those who had earned them. Again, an Enlightenment idea, the idea of the individual engaging in work in order to achieve social mobility and recognition based on merit. Not the aristocracy of the Ancien Regime, which was based on birth and privilege. This was an aristocracy of merit. And indeed, titles were given through military and civil service. So a whole new nobility was created, a service nobility. Napoleon also had a comment for that. He was actually a genius at aphorisms as well. He said that every French soldier of common rank carried a marshal's baton in his knapsack. In other words, in his France, you could become anything. Napoleon also was interested in education. He realized that if France was to fulfill its destiny, it had to have the proper level of training. Here, too, he was a child of the Enlightenment. All of the Enlightenment thinkers, beginning with John Locke, saw education as the instrument by which true freedom was going to be achieved. And Napoleon believed this very strongly because he had benefited from it as well. He created the lycée, that is the French secondary system, and he had scholarships in order to ensure that the brightest boys, regardless of social position, regardless of wealth, could be admitted to these elite schools and become the leaders of France. He created the university system, making France one of the most advanced states for higher education in the entire continent. Moreover, he balanced these things. There were the classical lycée, where you learned the classical languages and where you learned the traditional elite skills. But there were also technical lycées, where you could learn those technical skills that would benefit French industry. Napoleon had been an artillery officer, even though a noble. And he then had that kind of technical skill that allowed him to not only sight cannons, but also to realize that the ability of a general or an administrator or any politician or leader of society would be based on skill at whatever trade he chose to practice. Ironically, Napoleon's monarchical rule and the fulfillment of ideals of the Enlightenment also gave rise to elements that perhaps reflected this less well, and we shall talk about those in a moment. But nevertheless, he himself has to be seen, especially at this point in his career, he has to be seen as the success as a consequence of personal genius. He was an example of remarkable social mobility. Here was a man born again in the most distant provinces who ended up as Emperor of the French. He was a military adventurer whose legitimacy rested on power that was freely granted by a grateful French nation, and he was celebrated for it. Military glory was something that he not only reveled in, but he did for France, and the French people loved him for it. Well, great ambition and strategic skills established him perhaps as the greatest military commander since Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great. And just the list of his victories, which I shall not enumerate, but when you think of Wagram or Austerlitz or Friedland, you realize that you are reading the names that are carved on the Arc de Triomphe or the railway stations of Paris. So the next time you get off a train in the Gare d'Austerlitz in Paris, think of Napoleon and realize that he's celebrating not just the victory, but the people of France, long after, when that railway station was built, was recognizing a moment in its history that they saw as particularly defining. But as I suggested, there were problems and there were issues. This was not a continual celebration of glory and success. No one nation, even a nation under arms, can sustain almost 25 years of total war without some measure of failure and actually sowing the seeds of their own destruction. Well, the seeds of Napoleon's downfall were in fact sown with England. Napoleon despised England. He always called it a nation of shopkeepers. But that nation of shopkeepers had not only destroyed his fleet in Aboukir Bay in 1799, but in 1805, at the Battle off Cape Trafalgar, Admiral Nelson destroyed the French and Spanish fleets completely. This was not just a naval victory. It meant that Napoleon no longer had the ability, because he did not have the ships or control of the English Channel, to invade England, which was his plan. Napoleon's failure as a general is that, unlike Julius Caesar, for example, he couldn't imagine war at sea. So Napoleon felt that since he couldn't beat the British in England, he was going to defeat them another way. And so he devised and introduced, again, a brilliant idea, something far ahead of its time, the precursor of what would become economic warfare and containment. In 1806, he determined the continental system. The continental system was to cut Britain off from European trade and its colonies so that nation of shopkeepers would have nothing to sell in their shops. And by 1808, the continent had largely submitted to Napoleon's continental system, and England was beginning to suffer a bit, but there were too many opportunities for smuggling, and it never really worked properly. So England wasn't defeated, and England, in fact, ultimately would prove the instrument by which Napoleon would fall. Well, besides his military victories, Napoleon increasingly wanted to legitimize his regime and his dynasty in the eyes of not just the church and in France, but the other major powers of Europe. He wanted to maintain his enlightened principles, but at the same time, he wanted to find jobs for his extremely large family. During the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, wherever French armies had marched, they destroyed the Ancien Régime. And before Napoleon's coronation, when France remained a republic, the French armies had removed kings and princes and established republics in their place, often with curious or interesting classical or historical names. Holland, for example, became the Batavian Republic, named after the tribes of the Batavii described in Julius Caesar. Milan became the Ambrosian Republic, after St. Ambrose and the traditional name of republican government in that city. But after he became emperor, Napoleon reestablished those states as monarchies ruled by members of his family. He had a lot of brothers and sisters, and they all expected good jobs. So he began giving other people's thrones to his family. His older brother Joseph was first named King of Naples when the Bourbons were driven out, and then when a better job came along, he was made King of Spain, and Napoleon's brother-in-law, Murat, then became King of Naples. His brother Louis was made King of Holland, and his brother Jerome was made King of Westphalia, a country that didn't even exist. It was southwest Germany, an area carved out of the Holy Roman Empire. But Napoleon had lots of brothers. He needed to have lots of thrones. His sisters he either married into princely families or, on occasion, gave principalities of their own, such as Lucca in Italy. Despite all of this and his dynastic ambitions and his desire to establish a family that ultimately would control Europe in a kind of united way, and Napoleon continually said, and he wrote after his fall, that his real intention was to unite Europe, he still was anxious to sit at the big table. He still wanted to be accepted by the ancient dynasties of Europe. And also, he had a pressing need for an heir. Napoleon's first wife, Josephine, was older. She had children already by the Vicomte de Beauharnais, and in fact, Napoleon's stepson was made the Viceroy of Italy. But nevertheless, Napoleon wanted a son of his own. So he divorced Josephine, and he married the young Austrian Archduchess, Maria Louise of Habsburg. The union was clearly a success because Napoleon did have a son, to whom he gave the rather ambitious title of King of Rome. But these dynastic and imperial pretensions didn't do what he expected. They didn't induct him into that close fraternity of European dynasties. He was seen again as a kind of parvenu, and it alienated other nations, and in many instances, and in one particularly dangerous one, provided a focus for their enmity towards the French, which helped to shape their national pride. The example is Spain. In 1808, Ferdinand VII of Spain, who was a horror of a human being in every way, he was autocratic, he was stupid, he was vicious, he was a nasty man. But at least he was their nasty man, and the Spanish didn't want him deposed so that there could be room made for Napoleon's brother Joseph. Joseph, moreover, thought that he could win the Spanish over by treating them like enlightened Frenchmen. He, in fact, tried to be an ideal enlightened monarch. He gave Spain a constitution. He finally lifted Spain from the heavy hand of the church. But all of this just made him more hated. He was, after all, French. He was being supported by a French army. And the Spanish then began a guerrilla war aided by the British. And this guerrilla war is perhaps best illustrated in The Horrors of War of Francisco Goya. Those terrible moments illustrated in those engravings reflect not only the Spanish hatred and hostility to the French, but the suffering that the French and the Spanish underwent in order to try and keep Joseph Bonaparte on the throne. But Spain provided a beachhead for the British, and the expeditionary force under Arthur Wellesley, who would eventually become the Duke of Wellington, began to move, and the French were being defeated at battles like Vittoria, for which Beethoven wrote a very odd piece of music called Wellington's Victory that had strange mechanical instruments that sounded like rifles. But at times of military victory, all kinds of odd things happen. The French armies were defeated in Spain in 1812 and 1813, and the British began moving into France itself. In 1812, Tsar Alexander I refused to support the continental system, so Napoleon wanted to impose it on him, and Napoleon invaded Russia with the great Grande Armée. 600,000 soldiers marched into Russia. There was very little military contact, only a little battle at Borodino outside of Moscow. The French captured Moscow, but Alexander had abandoned it. The army and the court moved into the hinterland, and the city was set on fire. Napoleon, in a burning city with nothing really to support him, winter coming, decided to retreat. And Napoleon did retreat, returning to France, but the effective, not just battle and harassment by the Russians, but the effect of the starvation, and particularly the effect of winter and desertion, resulted in about 570,000 men either dying or deserting, never to be found. These events turned the tide against Napoleon, and eventually he was defeated and he surrendered to the Allies and abdicated for the first time at the Chateau of Fontainebleau in 1814. The Grand Alliance against him still recognized that he had become an emperor. You didn't kill kings lightly, and one of the reasons France was so hated by so many of the established classes was the Regicide Act of the execution of Louis XVI, so that you weren't going to imprison and execute Napoleon. Instead, he was really given an honorable exile on the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy, a wonderful place with a beautiful climate. He was even left with an empty imperial title. He was the Emperor of Elba. But Napoleon, who had ruled much of Europe, was not content with this beautiful but tiny island. And he escaped and returned to France and tried to reclaim his throne that was now occupied by the restored Bourbon younger brother of Louis XVI, who was now Louis XVIII. Louis XVIII had kept many of Napoleon's very experienced and skilled officers in place, sent Marshal Ney, one of Napoleon's favorite soldiers, the bravest of the brave, to stop him. But Ney and the army went over to their old emperor, and the French armies then united in order to try and restore Napoleon to the imperial throne. But it was short-lived. It was just the 100 Days adventure. Napoleon and his army were defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, and Napoleon's second exile was much less pleasant than the first. He was sent to the Rock of St. Helena in the southern Atlantic, and it was there that he died in 1821. The Napoleonic Wars tended to overshadow the fears raised by the French Revolution. Nevertheless, the victorious powers also had to quell any revolutionary feelings remaining in Europe, and these wars were identified as the cause of 25 years of unspeakable suffering and conflagration. A Europe-wide solution was needed in order to address this problem of what to do after 25 years of war, what to do after a revolution, what to do after Napoleon. And the problems were so complex that there had to be a complex solution. And the one decided upon was a return to a general multilateral peace conference such as the one used at Westphalia to end the 30 Years' War. It was that meeting, called for Vienna, that we are going to discuss in our next lecture, where the Congress of Vienna restored Europe to a degree while at the same time recognized that fundamental change had happened and it was impossible to turn the clock back completely, regardless how much some of the less reconstructed minds of imperial Europe really wished to accept.